Welcome. On behalf of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, my name is Tim Swijs. I'm the Director of Research here. Today we're gonna host a symposium on Sino-American maritime competition to launch a special issue of security studies. The study of sea power has been a topic of central concern in history and in military studies and strategic studies. From Mahan to Corbett, from Kennedy to Lombard. Yet it has not been a topic of central concern in the discipline of international relations studies in recent years and recent decades, nor of security studies. So in light of the resurgence of interstate strategic competition generally and the emergence of great power competition between China and the US specifically, this special issue of security studies is on military maritime dynamics and its implication for international peace and security is more than timely indeed. This topic, as some of the authors have noticed, is indeed too important to be left to the admirals, and therefore there's a need to study maritime great power competition. Today we have three panels with the authors of the different papers. Each panel lasts about 30 minutes. And each author presents his or her or their paper in about 6 to 7 minutes, followed by a commentator who will discuss the paper. Following the three panels, we'll have a Q&A with the entire audience of all participants. We invite all participants to submit their questions to Q&A. We'll look them up and we'll call upon you in the final session and we'll just beam you up as if this were a live conference, give you the mic, put the camera on you, and you can zoom in from your study, your living room, or wherever it is that you are. So today, we're gonna start off with a very interesting session on session one with Jonathan Caverley and Pete Dombrowski. I'm gonna kick off with a paper, Cruising for a Bruising, Maritime Competition in Anti-Access Age, followed by Sara Mitchell, who will present her paper, Clashes at Sea. We are very lucky to have such distinguished authors and panelists today. Hi, John, welcome to the stage. Let me just say that Jonathan Caverley is Professor of Strategy in the Strategic and Operational Research Department of the Naval War College Center for Naval War Affairs Studies and a research scientist in political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. John, without further ado, please take the floor. There's Peter Dombrowski as well. Hi, Peter. Welcome to our panel. And Peter Dombrowski is the director of the Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute and a professor of strategy in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval College. Welcome to the stage, gentlemen. We look forward to your presentations. Could I please ask you to limit your presentations to about 6-7 minutes? I'll give you a sign when we think that time is running out. The floor is yours, John and Pete.
Well, I will defer to my colleague, Peter, who will give our prepared remarks. But thank you very much for this really remarkable assemblage of people that we can talk about this really important topic. So I'll defer to Peter now. Peter.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon for those of you in the other side of the Atlantic. It's really great to be here, and I want to thank the Center for hosting this event. When John and I put this special issue together, we actually did two papers. We did an intro paper to set up all the work that was done by the fine scholars that joined us, and then we did our own substantive paper, Cruising for a Bruising. What I'm going to do today is a little bit of a combination. I'm going to do a very short sort of intro, which I hope will provide context for the entire set of papers. And then I'll make the arguments that John and I do our papers. And we divided up the labor because we're doing a few of these presentations. So I'm going to do today, and John will jump in on Q&As. And then other times we do this dog and pony show, we will switch. So, let's talk about why Sino-American and maritime relations are so important. The first thing to say is that for roughly 10 to 15 years, the People's Liberation Navy and related elements of Chinese naval power, from shipbuilding to the management of international ports, to its Coast Guard, and what some people call the Maritime militia have grown remarkably. For the Europeans in the audience, just for context, since 2014, the PLAN has launched more tonnage than all European navies combined. Moreover, the PLAN strategy, as near as we can tell from documentation, from analysis by Sino-American, for Chinese experts, is that the PLAN strategy has evolved and become increasingly outward-looking. Roughly in the early 2000s and before, the PLAN was really involved with near coastal defense in the Chinese littoral and the Asian littoral. Now, today, by the beginning in the mid 2000s, China is undertaking more of a blue water strategy with what they call far seas operations, everywhere from Djibouti and the Eastern Med to world cruises. Moreover, the Chinese defense paper issued in 2015 elevated the maritime domain within the PLA's formal strategic guidance. It focused on modernization, winning local wars under conditions of informationalization. Sorry for that. Moreover, the budget is increasing enormously. Janes is predicting that there's going to be a 55% increase in the Chinese military budget between the the 2015 and the early 2000s. It's also increasing the share of the overarching PLA budget. So the maritime force, the PLAN, is actually consuming the largest share of the Chinese defense budget. If you look forward, there's some predictions that Beijing will have 4 carrier battle groups by 2030, and the PLAN Marine Corps has expanded to about 30,000 personnel. Finally, in terms of the infrastructure necessary to support the PLAN, Chinese naval journals have predicted, or recommended, I should say, developing more overseas bases, logistic networks, and doctrinal ideas such as small battle groups that will allow for more ambitious far seas operations. Now, as for the US Navy, despite the PLAN's gains, the United States remains the only truly global force. The fleet has twice as much tonnage as China, although this fleet has shrunk. We operate 10 or 11 aircraft carriers. Each of these aircraft carriers outclass any planned or existing Chinese aircraft carriers. But China doesn't just have a navy. The Chinese problematic also involves a relationship between, in the American context, the European context, we'd call a joint force. So China, within its within the range rings of land-based aircrafts and land-based missiles, can project power out into the littoral and beyond. So it's not just the PLAN, it's the PLAN plus the strategic rocket forces, the Air Force, and this essentially prevents both American friends and allies in the regions and extra-regional powers, what the US military calls, the Chinese themselves don't, a situation where they have something approaching anti-access and area desire. Now, so the transition to John and I's paper, the issue is the growth of the PLA and especially the PLAN, uncertainty about Chinese intentions. We know that they're preparing for far seas operations, but what does this mean in terms of the grand strategy of China's role within the global economy and the international security environment? Further, as we point out in our introduction to the special issue, future clashes with the United States are most likely to take place at sea. So what can the structure of the two fleets and the particular mix of weapons tell us about the potential for war at sea in the coming years? Now, I haven't talked a lot about American friends and allies and the other sea powers in in the Asian littoral and farther abroad, including the Europeans who operate in the Indo-Pacific region, but happy to take that on in the Q&A section. Okay, so the Cruising for the Bruising paper is based on classic national security concepts such as the offense-defense balance. And the growing consensus amongst experts that suggests that we now are in a world of defense dominance. The mutual desire of each opponent's Navy and Air Force to operate unmolested in war. In fact, some people like our colleague Eugene Goltz, or our friend Eugene Goltz, talk about a no man's sea, where neither the PLAN or the US or any of the potential regional navies actually can operate under wartime conditions.
Peter, 2 more minutes, please.
2 more minutes, yes. So
Okay.
our article sheds doubt on this consensus. We suggest that the unique characteristics of maritime competition have an impact on this denial regime. We argue that defense dominance will not lead to crisis stability at sea, because at sea, offense-defense distinguishability is low and the temptation to strike first is high. In short, if you have a ship or a submarine packed with VLS tubes, you don't know what's in those tubes. Are they defensively oriented, for example, for air and missile defense, or are they offense, land strike, or sea strike missiles? And in both navies, there is a culture, an organizational interest that is akin to the cult of offensive. There is a presumption of active, aggressive action forward, particularly in the US Navy. And denialism, the thought that there might be this no man's sea, is antithetical to the American perspective on how to deal with the rise of China in the maritime domain. So to sum up, we argue that there's a considerable body of agreement among security studies that defense dominates. But it is unclear that the fleets can take advantage or will take advantage to increase crisis stability. So the stakes of a dangerous competition between the United States and China are high. Just skipping ahead. What we'd like to argue for is more research in this realm, to look more carefully to distinguish in the offense-defense things in the denialist camp the particular challenges of the PLAN and the American force structures in combination in the American case with allies, to look at how we can, whether and how small crises can escalate, the advantages of the battle of the first salvo and shooting first. And what we want to do is think about that the building and operating fleets are domestic, huge economic undertakings, and that the importance of this investment in terms of crisis stability and the future of a conflict needs to be explored more firmly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for incisive insights and keeping more or less to time. Thank you, Peter. We have invited Jeremy Staes to comment on your joint papers. You're very right, of course. Jeremy is an Austrian-American defense analyst who's currently a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University, and it's Adjunct Center for Maritime Strategy and Security. And he's also the deputy director of the Austrian Center for Intelligence, Propaganda and Security Studies. To all participants, if you have any observations, comments, or questions, please enter them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up at the end of this symposium. Jeremy, the floor is yours to share your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you for solving the technical issues I've had. I hope everybody can hear me and see me. Hailing from a landlocked country, it appears that the lines of communication are quite difficult in these times. I've been asked to comment on the key arguments of this and implications of this great piece written by our American colleagues, Peter, who I know personally, and Jonathan, who I have the pleasure of commenting his paper now. and commenting on the shift to the Asia Pacific and the consequences for European security and defense, and also if there is such a thing as a shift away from the centrality of the land conflict or the land dimension. I will do this briefly. Well, I find this a very intriguing piece insofar as the two authors really look at the reasons for defense dominance, and the defense dominance will not lead to crisis stability. And they have a couple of reasons for that, namely in the environment that forces, especially US Navy and the Chinese fleet, are operating in. This difficulty, and John mentioned that already, Peter mentioned that already, the difficulty of distinguishing between the offensive and defensive capabilities, that's very important. Technology and the changing technology of how that actually adds into this. The uncertainty about opponents' capabilities, the culture of offense, and from a European perspective, looking at the US and the US Navy, that is something that maybe stands out a lot as a power projection Navy, a sea control Navy, but also that might apply to the Chinese Navy as well to a certain degree. And as they subsume and conclude that this is the interaction between the fleets might risk, and I quote, crisis or even war where much of the US fleet is endangered. They juxtapose the denialist schools, so active denial and offshore control, and come to the conclusion that both those schools might be a little optimistic and over-optimistic for similar reasons that Peter has already mentioned, that might not lead, those two ideas might not lead to crisis stability, namely to distinguish, to be able to distinguish capabilities, vertical launch systems being one point, and we'll come to that in just a sec, overlooking the non-material considerations of those entities of the navies, the overemphasis of military technology, and last but not least, the pursuit of offensive measures, and that is something. Was it the Naval Academy several times already? And if you get a little bit of this feeling of the veneration of CNOs and this idea of how important they are to the culture of the Navy, it sometimes is very interesting to see. Getting to the point, because I was asked to look at the consequences for European security, and I will look at it from a maritime perspective, but also look at a couple of other aspects as well. Europe and the European theater of operation, if you want to call it that, is very different, a very different area of operation, and the land domain is central to it and will continue to be central. Europe, we always use this term, it's a very diverse set of countries, amalgamate of countries with very different security issues. The land dimension plays a great role because, to quote Chris Perry, Rear Admiral Chris Perry, retired, that is where the people live, obviously. At the same time, there's a different alliance structure in Europe. As most of you, probably all of you know, we have NATO, we have the EU, we have bi- and multinational agreements. We have standing maritime forces, something we don't have in Asia, so that plays into this equation. And it is interesting that I get this question now, because I remember 10 years or 12 years ago, actually, that was already a question in the maritime domain about the US withdrawal from Europe, namely under the rebalancing under Obama. And I remember vividly of this discussion about Italian aircraft carriers, that they would substitute US carriers as the US carriers pass through the European theater to areas of operation more important, the Middle East and Asia Pacific. Well, a decade on, this has not come to pass. The reestablishment of the US Second Fleet, the ballistic missile destroyers en route to Spain, the Sixth Fleet very active in both in the Med and in the North Atlantic, in the Baltic, and great US naval presence in Europe at the same time. The US Army is looking for a role, and it's much more difficult for them in Asia Pacific. In Europe, they have a role, and you see it in the exercises such as Enforcer, where they skip the fast forward button and then actually conduct operations on land, have all the forces there already, really land-centric point of view. Looking at the time, I want to move on quickly, but there's a couple important points. European naval forces and armed forces have...
2 more minutes, please, Jeremy.
2 more, yep, gotcha. They are challenged. Great power competition at sea, creates rising thresholds in size and capability of those forces. And the big question, that's more or less the final point, that the big question so far, the premise was Europeans have to hold the line until the Americans come to help. What can European states do now if there is a conflict in the Asia Pacific with the US fleet in particular, and also the Air Force heavily involved? Can they go it alone? How can they hold the line? And therefore, I think to your question, final point, is that the land domain will remain central. European states will continue to look at it, at acquiring capabilities there, and their seaward approaches. So that is, I think, the maritime domain will not, it will gain in importance slightly to a measurable degree, but the land, it will remain land-centric in the European theater. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity for those short comments.
And thank you, Jeremy, for excellent remarks. Before we move on to the next panel, Jonathan, would you like to give a 2-minute rebuttal or some additional reflections on these comments?
Okay, I promise I will stay to 2 minutes. First of all, thank you, Jeremy. I cannot imagine a better commentator for this. It's a real honor to meet you virtually. On your final point, which is the one I'll focus on, what is Europe to do? One of the things that Peter and I try to emphasize in the paper is that the United States Navy has a very big decision ahead of it on how it's going to build its future fleet. One philosophy, right, and this is an old dilemma for any major Navy. One philosophy is, do you optimize for the high-end fight, i.e. in Asia? As Peter and you both acknowledge, it's a very, very tough problem if you're trying to deter continental-sized nuclear power with a lot of standoff weapons in a very heavily trafficked environment. If you optimize for that particular conflict, that Navy is unlikely to be able to perform the other duties well. So maybe 2 decades ago or 4 decades ago, the United States Navy could do any mission whatsoever because it was so dominant. Right now it has to make choices, and those choices may shortchange the European theater, and Europeans should respond to that accordingly. I have about 30 seconds, so I want to respond to a couple of questions that are in the Q&A. Mr. Raza and John Lindsay. Those are very big questions, if you guys can all see them. One is about if China only intends to have sort of regional effects, why is the United States doing this? And then the second one is Eugene Goltz really emphasizes the fact that there's a sensing network and there's a land-based network that should make defense dominant. The bottom line for both is that as China builds its capability, which is just natural, right? We don't ascribe motive to China. It's a giant power that's expanding outward, right? That encompasses major economic centers that are of vital interest to the United States, i.e. Japan, even Taiwan, Philippines, down through the Straits of Malacca. So it's unlikely that the United States will not ascribe some sort of revisionist motive to China, whether or not China actually has that plan. That is the problem with the security dilemma. And also, the United States Navy will feel obligated, according to plans, to operate forward under the umbrella, the weapons engagement zone of the anti-access capability of China. So you're still going to have a situation where the fleets are going to be in contact, and should the lights go out, should the electronic environment go bad, right? Both sides are going to have extremely itchy trigger fingers. And that's the crisis and stability that Peter and I talk about. I'd like to turn it back over. Tim, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Super, and thank you very much, Jonathan. And Jeremy, thank you for bringing in that European perspective and pointing us to the land component, so to speak, which brings me to a final observation. If maritime great power competition is too important to be left to the admirals, perhaps great power competition is too important to be left to the Americans and the Chinese alone, and us Europeans also need to step up. Thank you, Jonathan, Peter. We're gonna get back to you at the end of our symposium. Let me now please invite to the stage Sara McLaughlin Mitchell. who is the F. Wendell Miller Professor at the University of Iowa. And she's the co-director of the Issue Correlates of War project, amongst others, an associate editor of Foreign Policy Analysis and Research and Politics. Hi, Sara, welcome to the stage. We're very happy to have you here. I'm a great fan of the Issue Correlates of War project. And with great interest, I read your paper called Clashes at Sea, explaining the onset, militarization, and resolution of diplomatic maritime claims. Sara, the floor is yours. If you could keep your remarks to about 7 minutes, and then we're going to go to the commentator. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Oh, can you enable my screen sharing, please?
Yes, that's being done right now as we speak. Has it been enabled? Good, it has.
Can you see my slide?
Yes,
okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. Militarized clashes in the modern world are more often at sea than on land. Territorial disputes like Kashmir and Nagorno-Karabakh have declined over the past 2 centuries, but contentious maritime claims in places like the Spratly Islands and the Aegean Sea have increased significantly. My research focuses on diplomatic conflicts over maritime areas to better understand why maritime claims arise, why countries threaten, display, or use military force to pursue their claim-related goals, and how maritime claims are resolved peacefully. As co-director of the Issue Correlates of War project, I have collected data on 270 interstate diplomatic conflicts involving the ownership, access to, or usage of maritime areas, or what I call maritime claims. These conflicts involve the drawing of maritime boundaries, access to marine resources, and navigational rights in strategic locations. There are several findings in my research that I'll talk about here. First of all, I find that countries use military force to pursue their claims 41% of the time for traditional land disputes, but they also militarize maritime claims frequently, 29% of the time. And some regions like Asia Pacific have higher rates of militarization at 47% than we see for the average for all land-based disputes. However, maritime claims are much less likely to escalate to clashes with battle fatalities, so only 6% of the time versus 28% for territorial claims. However, I find that the risk of escalation is higher if issues involve both territory and maritime claims, such as Crimea. The second major finding is that maritime claims increased significantly as the global share of US naval tonnage declined. Thus, the size of the US naval fleet has significant consequences for past and future clashes at sea. I also find that states with greater naval capabilities are more revisionist in making new claims to offshore maritime areas, and that they use more coercive strategies to pursue their claims, unless they are facing countries with similar naval strength or naval parity. I interestingly find that traditional measures of capabilities like military, economic, and demographic power predict successful deterrence in territorial disputes, but have no effect in maritime claims. But on the other hand, naval preponderance is significant for deterrence in maritime disputes, but not territorial disputes. So this demonstrates that power is not fungible across diplomatic issues for deterrence, and that naval forces are uniquely positioned to deter attacks involving maritime issues. My next finding is that maritime areas with more valuable resources like oil, natural gas, fish, and minerals are managed with violence more often, which is not surprising. But I do have an interesting result that the presence of migratory fish stocks is the most likely resource to lead to militarization. Climate change will exacerbate these kind of conflict risks because warmer oceans increase scarcities in many fishery stocks by changing migration patterns, increasing fish mortality rates, and changing water acidity levels. And so we may see greater escalation over contested fishing grounds in the future. And the use of maritime militias by countries like China, Vietnam, and the Philippines to defend Defend fishing grounds is not surprising, as states expand security measures to protect their citizens' access to valuable fish stocks. Maritime boundaries are also ambulatory, and thus states' sovereignty over resource valuable EEZs will be compromised as sea levels rise. Now, while democratic countries do not typically become involved in territorial disputes, I find that democratic dyads experience more maritime claims than any other regime parents, showing that maritime issues could be a potential threat to the democratic peace. However, I also find that countries who have signed and ratified the Law of the Sea Convention are less likely to make new diplomatic claims to maritime areas. They're less likely to use military force to pursue their goals, and they're more amenable to peaceful resolution, especially through international courts like ITLOs. I also find that democracies are more supportive of the Law of the Sea Convention. However, the United States has not ratified the convention, and this puts it at a disadvantage for negotiating future maritime issues through the institution, including resource rights in the area outside of countries' EEZ claims. China has actively militarized several maritime claims where it challenges the issue status quo. And this is predicted by my models because China places a high salience value on these issues. And there are other power and other factors that predict conflict in these cases. What are the implications for Sino-American competition? Well, the US is allied with a lot of the states involved in these claims or has ties to them, including Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And so these dyadic issues have the potential to escalate and generate US involvement. Interestingly, I find though that freedom of navigation operations have no deterrent effects on maritime conflict escalation in Asia Pacific. But escalation is less likely in strategic locations like the Straits of Malacca when US naval power is strong. US maritime security will be affected by several maritime hotspots in the world. Several of the top rising sea powers today have revisionist goals at sea. This includes Russia, Egypt, Indonesia, India, Iran, and North Korea. And climate change will not only generate resource scarcity and create greater competition for maritime resources, rising sea levels and warming oceans will alter today's maritime boundaries, open up the Northern Sea Route and Northwest Passage, and set the stage for future clashes at sea. As the US positions itself for greater competition with China, it will also need to defend its maritime boundaries at home, as Russia's provocative moves near Alaska recently demonstrate. Thank you.
Sara, thank you for a very crystal clear and enlightening presentation. Friso, can I ask you to share your comments? Friso Stevens is a China and East Asian Affairs specialist at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and he is a PhD student at the Leiden University Institute for Security and Global Affairs, who recently published in National Interest, by the way. Friso, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself, and please keep to 6 minutes. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this very interesting talk. I'll go straight to the mechanism on the onset, militarization, and resolution of maritime claims, the scientific heart of the paper. On page 16, it is less clear what the relative weight of other plausible intervening variables are in the arrow chart, and how they work in conjunction inside the black box of decision-making in, for example, Beijing. So in other words, how they influence going from the critical stage 1 to stage 2. In particular, the domestic politics level deflection explanation could be helpful, but it's not mentioned. I think especially in East Asia, most of the intangible issues are nurtured around nationalism and wielded for domestic legitimizing purposes, in particular in China's case. Second point I'd make is that on page 18, it says figure 4 demonstrates that the total number of maritime claims increased dramatically as the share of US global naval power declined. A caveat to this assertion could be that after 1989, during the height of the uncontested US power in the 1990s, the unipolar moment, the claims were at its highest. Though the US naval power line increased a little bit, I'd argue that relative warship tonnage does not explain the whole picture. My third point relates to page 20. There are two very interesting statements there. States with greater naval strength initiate more diplomatic claims to maritime zones, 1. And 2, dyads that are closer to parity in naval capabilities are more likely to experience claims. As to empirical falsification of theory, if we take the Chinese case of artificial construction of islands in the South China Sea that commenced in the beginning of 2014, several reservations can be made. The 9-dash line claim exists from, of course, 1947 on, but in 2014, few observers would assert that China was even near approaching US naval might. And while Hillary Clinton had immersed the US into the island disputes in Hanoi in July 2010, and the US having a defense treaty commitment with the Philippines, China challenged the claimants and the US nonetheless. Or, question, do alliances and tacit partnerships not matter for Beijing's threat calculus? And what about the individual level explanation of Xi coming to power in that year? My fourth and last point relates to the variation in issue saliency. On page 24, it is stated that over half of China's ongoing maritime claims experienced militarized conflict, which is not surprising given the average salience score for these issues ranges from 7 to 12. I'm curious as to the definition and threshold of militarized conflict, which seems relatively easily met. Is the militarization with defensive capabilities on the artificial islands in the South China Sea by China, for example, already a conflict? I think China, especially under Xi, tacitly threatens a lot and moves in the gray zone, posturing with capabilities, is, I'd argue, part of the deterrence approach, without direct, overt military confrontation. Yeah, these were my points. Thank you.
Thank you, Friso, for excellent observations. Sara, would you like to take 2 minutes and respond, if not to all points, to a few of them?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for your comments. Very useful. First of all, on the weight of other variables like domestic politics, I agree that domestic politics is important. I have done some work on diversionary uses of force, so have found that the timing of the initiation of force in maritime claims relates to things like inflation or unemployment at home. So it is the case that leaders are paying attention to domestic politics, especially when they're in terms of predicting when they will militarize these issues. On the relative war tonnage, yeah, I recognize that there are limitations to these kind of quantitative measures, but I don't include dyadic US-China variables in the analysis. I only use the systemic measure of US naval tonnage. So, but it would be useful to look at. One of my students did an analysis in Asia where he looked at the regional dyadic naval capabilities and how they shifted over time, and he finds that does have a strong effect on when you get militarization. I have not looked at alliances in this particular work, but in some of my other research, we find that defensive alliances can deter militarized attacks. So certainly I think alliances could be very relevant here, and yet definitely in cases like the Senkaku Biao, yeah, of course, alliances are relevant in those instances. What is militarization? I'm using the militarized interstate dispute data set from the Correlative War Project. So I'm sort of limiting myself to the way that they think about militarization. But I will say that in our data set, we look at every militarized dispute and we only include it if it is over the specific issue at stake. So we would not include, say, a China-Japan militarized dispute that was separate from, say, the dispute over Senkaku Diallo. So you can at least be confident that the militarized disputes I've looked at are connected to that works.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Sara, and thank you, Friso. Hereby we're ending our first session. The first session really concerned the quintessential characteristics of the maritime domain, its relationship with conflict escalation, and certain maritime dynamics, military maritime dynamics that play a role there, which makes for a natural bridge to our second session, in which we're going to talk about different maritime strategies, including naval blockades and their link with escalation. So we're happy to ask to the stage even Braden Montgomery with a paper on primacy and punishment, US grand strategy, maritime power and military options to manage decline, who will be then followed by Fiona Cunningham with a paper on the maritime rung on the escalation ladder. But we're going to start with Evan. Welcome, Evan. Evan is a senior fellow and a director of research and studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Welcome, Evan. The floor is yours. If you could keep to the 7 minutes, that would be much appreciated.
I will do my best. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Since my time is short, what I would like to do is try to quickly ask and attempt to answer 4 questions that I think broaden the discussion a bit beyond the Sino-US relationship. Those 4 questions are, what is the central strategy dilemma facing the United States? Why is it so hard to solve? How might we try to solve it? And what are some of the implications for Europe and our European allies? So first, what is the central dilemma for US grand strategy and defense strategy? To my mind, the central dilemma is how to manage 4 serious rivals across 3 separate regions. US officials have made it clear that competing with China and Russia is their main priority, but they are also determined to counter the DPRK and contain Iran. And the past 4 years, I think, are a reminder that second-tier threats often consume the most attention. So to put it another way, the United States has what I've referred to elsewhere as a 3-theater problem. It needs to worry about high-end contingencies in the Asia-Pacific, in Europe, and the Middle East, and those contingencies could unfold alone, in sequence, or in the worst-case scenario, simultaneously. Second, why is the 3-theater problem increasingly hard to manage? I think it's hard to manage for several reasons. First, US rivals are improving their military capabilities. Second, the most obvious way to deal with the problem, either spending more on defense to keep up with rivals or shedding commitments so you don't have to worry about them, both seem to be off the table right now. Third, and the reason that I focus on in the paper, is how we do force planning in Washington. So basically, when trying to size and shape a military to deal with multiple rivals, there's a tendency to divide those rivals into 2 categories, pacing threats and lesser included cases. That's based on an assumption that if you have the ability to deal with the strongest opponents, you can certainly deal with anything else that comes along. So today, Russia and especially China are obviously the pacing threats for the US military services, and the DPRK, Iran, and others are those lesser included cases. That approach makes a lot of sense on paper. It's a good way to achieve efficiencies, but it can come at the expense of effectiveness because peacetime deployments to one theater impose opportunity costs in other theaters, and wartime losses anywhere negatively affect the balance of military power everywhere else. So for example, if the United States is indeed relying on more or less the same set of capabilities and the same concepts for all of its rivals, then if it were to fight China, it would have far fewer forces available to deter or fight Iran. And even worse, if the United States were fighting Iran first, it would have far fewer capabilities to deter or fight China. So the third question I want to raise is, how do you start mitigating this force planning challenge? What I discuss in the paper is the virtue of diversification in defense strategy. basically adopting different strategies against different opponents to at least somewhat reduce the amount of overlap that exists. The United States obviously has the virtue of being a maritime power, and maritime powers typically have a number of military strategies available to them, in large part because their naval forces are inherently flexible. So today, for example, there are three main defense strategies available to Washington: denial, which is stopping aggression when and where it occurs; rollback, which entails overturning changes to the status quo through brute force after they occur; and punishment, imposing costs on rivals through bombardment or blockade until they give up and relinquish their gains. The 2017 National Security Strategy and 2018 National Defense Strategy both emphasize denial, especially when dealing with great power rivals. But the United States might need to think a bit about alternatives to denial, at least when dealing with minor powers, so that it can juggle all of its commitments. So the example that I suggest and talk about in the paper is emphasizing punishment rather than denial in the case of Iran, specifically punishment via maritime blockade. There's been a fair bit of debate about the possibility of using a blockade against China as either a deterrent or a warfighting approach, and Fiona will talk about that in much greater detail. But there's been comparatively less discussion so far on the possibility of using this approach against Iran should a conflict occur, even though as a relatively isolated resource exporter, it should be vulnerable to maritime blockade, at least in principle. And that might help the United States to avoid weakening its position vis-a-vis China in particular, again, should a conflict break out in the Middle East between the United States and Iran. And I'm happy to discuss the pros and cons of that approach more in the Q&A. So the last question that I'll raise and end on this note is, what are some of the implications of the challenges the United States faces with this three-theater problem, its approach to force planning, and the strategy options available to it? What are the implications for Europe and European allies? And I'll briefly mention 2 points that I think are consistent with the discussion surrounding John and Peter's paper. First, now that Europe no longer occupies pride of place among the three theaters that the United States worries about, the US and its allies, I think, need to consider more closely how to avoid opportunistic aggression in the region if a conflict breaks out in the Asia Pacific or the Middle East. So if a conflict breaks out elsewhere, and especially if the United States needs to withdraw some of its forces from Europe to manage those conflicts, what is the best way to avoid opportunism on the part of Russia in Europe? Second, if European navies are going to be asked to play a bigger role alongside the United States outside the region, where and how should they do that? There's a trend right now toward pushing European allies to bolster their presence in the Asia Pacific to support the United States in its primary theater. But I think there's also a case to be made for European allies perhaps helping the United States cover down in other regions of concern, like, for example, the Middle East, especially if a conflict breaks out elsewhere and the US is distracted. Those two issues, as I think about it, are inherently in tension, protecting Europe when the US is occupied elsewhere, but also getting European allies to assist the United States when it's occupied elsewhere. They're in tension, but I think that we're trying to resolve that tension and see where it leads might be a fruitful avenue for research. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan, for an interesting paper and a clear presentation. And we've asked Louis Simon to share some thoughts on your paper. Welcome, Louis. Louis is a research professor at the Institute for European Studies and director of the Brussels office of the Elcano Royal Institute. Louis, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you. Thank you very much to you, to Paul, and to the Hague Center for the invite and the opportunity to comment on such a terrific special issue, and congrats to the editors and all the authors. So since I've been asked to keep it to some 3 to 5 minutes, I'm going to make a couple of brief points about Evan's paper. But I'll actually return to it later on, as I'll try to find some links between that piece and the one on the influence of sea power on politics. I must say first that I really enjoyed the paper, so I'm not sure I have much to add here. Let me just start perhaps reacting to the main point that I believe Evan raised during his short presentation today, which is that prioritizing between theaters and competitors is the key strategic challenge that the US faces. I would tend to agree with that, and I think this is also why it's so important for European allies in this case to have a better understanding of the mechanics of US engagement in other regions, in particular the Asia Pacific, right? So I think that's why also this seminar from a European perspective is so relevant. Beyond that point, I think that by linking primacy and denial, the paper actually makes what I think is a rather original contribution to the deterrence literature. I, for one, tend to associate primacy with punishment and denial with the strategies that rising or medium powers employ against hegemons, right? And in fact, as I see it, the whole anti-axis and area denial discussion is largely about how powers like China, Russia, or even Iran, who cannot take the US on its own terms, look for asymmetric ways to complicate US power projection and to deny US forces access into a given theater of operations and complicate their movement and communications once in theater. And Evan has written plenty about this himself in the past. What I observe in East Asia, and perhaps Evan, you have you seem to have a different take here, is a division of labor of sorts, whereby some US allies like Taiwan or Japan invest in denial concepts and capabilities, and the United States can do punishment by leveraging its military overmatch to signal escalation dominance to China. Of course, the US can also contribute to denial, and you've alluded to that, both directly by using its assets in theater and also indirectly by helping underpin allied denial capabilities in different ways, right? So my sense is that punishment still remains a very important tenet of US deterrence strategy in Asia, but also Evan's point about how punishment-bound capabilities, if you will, are good for all theaters strikes me as very compelling, actually. And I thought that was sort of one of the most interesting points. I think that adding a bit more context on the whole debate between deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial could have helped, because I was wondering, Evan, whether you may not be underselling your contribution a little bit, at least conceptually. I was also wondering, sort of trying to think beyond that, beyond military strategy, whether what you're actually doing here, at least in part, is provide a military concept that vindicates a grand strategy of restraint and offshore balancing, at least for the Middle East, right? And if that's indeed what you're doing, I think it would be a welcome move in the sense that the whole debate between restrainers, offshore balancers, primacists, and deep engagers is often fought in very generic and abstract terms by sort of moving away from the question of whether different regions necessitate different levels of US engagement. Even though in recent years we've actually seen more detail in the context of that debate, in particular, offshore balancers and restrainers are beginning to make the point that their respective frameworks would work better in Europe and the Middle East and less so in Asia. In fact, Barry Posen has been making that point recently, Chris Lane too. So I was wondering, in what ways does your argument differ from that? I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Luis. Evan, would you care to respond? Take a few minutes.
Sure, and thanks for the generous comments and the great questions. I know you've written on this issue recently too, and so it's good to have this conversation. I'll just make a few quick points in response. One on the issue of kind of how this fits with the pro-restraint arguments for regions like the Middle East in particular. I think it is broadly consistent with that. I mean, I think there is a growing sentiment that the United States is going to need to reduce its commitments to that region in particular, or at least its presence to a degree, in order to focus more on first the Asia Pacific and secondarily Europe. I think there tends to be a little ambiguity about what that means. It's sort of, you're all in or you're all out. And the reality, I think we all can probably agree, is going to be somewhere in between. So what I was trying to do, at least with this, is contribute a bit by saying, okay, even if you do want to reduce your day-to-day commitment and focus on other theaters, but the reality is you may get drawn back in. The US-Iranian rivalry has been going on for my entire lifetime. I don't see it changing anytime soon. What might you do to at least cost minimize that effort? And so that's where I see it contributing there. I think you're absolutely right in terms of pushing allies in the Asia Pacific in particular to embrace denial. And Eugene Goltz and others have written about how states in the region can do that and leverage anti-access area denial capabilities of their own. I'm actually hoping to start a new project looking at more detail at that. I have some skepticism about the extent to which allies can and will fully embrace that denial mindset and can implement it even if they do. But I think that bears watching. And then the last point in terms of the United States and whether it's focused on denial or punishment, I think certainly on paper, the United States has focused on denial, especially in the last couple years with the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. And if you talk to folks who are involved in that deeply, that's certainly their mindset. A very straightforward argument that the best way to deter and assure is to be able to stop aggression when it occurs, prevent an adversary from overturning status quo. I think the distinction between denial and punishment, though, gets a little bit blurred, especially as China develops more, more expensive, exquisite power projection capabilities, because now you're getting into a world where, frankly, if you adopted and could implement, say, the Bob Work or Michel Flournoy approach of let's sink the entire, have the ability to sink the entire PLAN in 36 hours, it's a contribution to denial, obviously, if they can't seize territory with their naval forces, but it's obviously punishment in the sense of imposing costs by taking away some very expensive, prestigious assets. So I think in that sense, the distinction between the two, certainly in that theater, is getting a little bit blurrier than it used to be. Thank you.
Super, and thank you, Evan. Louis, you observed that some of these debates on grand strategy tend sometimes to be ephemeral and rather abstract. I think the same applies to discussions about deterrence through punishment, deterrence through denial. And in these discussions, we often think what a force blue does and how red responds, but we don't really have a clue how red actually perceives these actions. And that makes, again, for a wonderful bridge to the second paper in this panel by Fiona Cunningham on the maritime rung on the escalation ladder, naval blockades and US-China conflict, in which Fiona really looks at a variety of issues, including Chinese perceptions. So welcome, Fiona. Fiona Cunningham is an assistant professor of political science and international affairs at the George Washington University. Fiona, welcome. The floor is yours. If you could keep to about 7 minutes, that would be much appreciated.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction into the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, for the invitation, to John and Peter for this terrific special issue, and to my discussant. I'm really delighted to present my paper, which, as was introduced, is called The Maritime Rung on the Escalation Ladder. And what this paper does is to examine the merits of the US naval blockade of Chinese merchant shipping as one option the United States has for coercing China in a future limited war, while also trying to limit escalation. And to put my conclusion sort of up front, I argue that a blockade as an option gives both Beijing and Washington time and opportunities to negotiate an end to a limited conflict, compared to some of the other kinds of campaigns that could suppress Chinese anti-access and area denial capabilities, which would compress the time and opportunities for negotiations. And the idea of this kind of a campaign is to put the burden on Chinese leaders to gamble with further escalation in a conflict and giving them plenty of time to mull the odds of the success of doing so. And US decision makers might turn to this blockade to limit escalation, even if it isn't the most effective way of changing Chinese calculations. And I think that's the reason why naval blockades are still talked about by international relations scholars, despite the clear preference that Evan just highlighted for denial within some of the US military planners. So my paper, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but also look at whether it's really feasible to conduct a blockade that limits escalation, and really would China's reaction help the United States to limit escalation if it went down this path. So firstly, back to this question of why a blockade. I think the United States faces a problem of how to end a limited war with another nuclear armed great power, which is obviously quite familiar to Europe, but in a new context in the Indo-Pacific. And kind of two options, at least in the last decade, I think have been debated quite extensively. One is conventional strikes deep on the Chinese mainland that would unpick the sensors and weapons supporting China's anti-access area denial capability, which has been critiqued for raising the risk of inadvertent nuclear escalation because of the way that China operates its nuclear forces, and indeed the idea that the air defenses that would need to be unpicked would be protecting those forces as well. So to avoid those risks, others then advocated for a distant blockade, which would target China's merchant shipping beyond the range of its anti-access area denial capabilities, and also take advantage of the fact that China depended upon maritime trade. But then critics have argued that that campaign might be ineffective in actually changing China's calculations because it could adapt to a blockade, it could seek its key resources in other areas, and if it was effective, it could end up leading Chinese leaders to escalate anyway. So I argue in the paper that while I don't think blockades prevent escalation, they do have some features that can help at least to limit that, sort of escalatory pressures. And they include the fact that they preserve the nuclear threshold and treat the homeland of another nuclear power as a sanctuary, which I think are key thresholds in limited conflict. They slow the pace of the conflict down, which ensures that any decisions by Chinese leaders to escalate would be deliberate and with as much information as one can hope for in wartime. And finally, they can be implemented in a way that avoids direct encounters with another state's military forces, like this sort of sinking all of the ships in China's fleet in 72 hours. That could put pressure on Chinese leaders to escalate because of any losses in that contingency. And these features could make a blockade appealing to US decision makers who want to manage escalation, but also find a way to end a limited war with China. But I argue in the paper that blockades can't limit escalation in all circumstances. Blockades that successfully limited escalation could only occur if the US isn't necessarily operating forces close to China's shores in a primary conflict, which rules out one of the main contingencies of Taiwan unless the US chooses not to deploy forces on or around the island. And it also needs to be implemented in a way that would limit escalation. And so specifically, I look at a campaign that would intercept and divert ships that are destined to or coming from the PRC for trade purposes, and locating the blockade force outside of the range of China's anti-access area denial capabilities at the Malacca, Lombok, and Sunda Straits. So can the US actually carry out such a campaign? This is turning to some of the findings of the paper. I find that this kind of a blockade campaign would be demanding for the US Navy, and it would require extensive support from states bordering the maritime choke points. And I come to this conclusion based on looking at a previous US-led maritime interception operation to enforce UN sanctions on Iraqi merchant shipping before Desert Storm in 1990. And so 2 quick points about feasibility based on that study is that the United States would require about 30 surface ships to be able to conduct an intercept and divert kind of campaign at the Southeast Asian Straits. And it would be able to conduct this, I conclude, even if its most capable surface combatants are needed for the primary conflict in another area, but it would be deploying half of the small surface combatants in the entire US fleet, and its readiness plans suggest this would be possible, but very demanding. Second, the Iraqi campaign suggests the support of neighboring states is really critical. So access to facilities in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore would be key to the campaign's success. So turning to China's reaction, I think China's response would be heavily context dependent. So instead of speculating about what it could do, I looked to Chinese sources to see what kinds of campaigns the PLA had written about that would involve a response to a blockade. And they do describe a sea line guarding campaign that would counter a blockade by attacking and evading blockade forces and escorting merchant shipping. But that kind of a campaign is a bad fit for an interception style blockade because it assumes that the blockade forces already or would soon attack Chinese merchant shipping. So conducting those kinds of operations would put at risk PLA Navy forces that might not fare well in an engagement with the United States Navy, and China might want to preserve them for the primary fight. So I conclude that if China responds militarily, it's more likely to escalate asymmetrically, but not to the nuclear level. It could conduct something like conventional missile strikes on US bases and assets in the region, cyber attacks or counter space attacks, which could offer a more certain coercive effect and military advantage while preserving China's naval forces. So I'll end, as I know I'm nearly at my time, with a couple of comments about implications for European security. I think as Evan suggested, it's likely the US is going to ask for European assistance in any Indo-Pacific war. And so I think Europeans, as European strategists, are kind of considering what this means for them. They might also want to consider what their least bad option among US options for coercing China to end a limited war might look like. And my research suggests two considerations. The first is that in the event of a blockade, the United States might ask Europe to limit its economic interactions with China to increase the effectiveness of a blockade. And it might also ask its allies to assist with some of the constabulary aspects of a campaign against China, which could include the enforcement of a blockade with their own naval assets. And I think this poses some economic, political, strategic, and military challenges for Europe. The second consideration I wanted to note is that the option of deep strikes on the Chinese mainland could have implications for Europe, even if it is never carried out, specifically because I think it impacts US nuclear arms control with Russia. The potential for attrition of China's nuclear forces in such a campaign is a pressure on Chinese nuclear forces to increase their size. And if the United States does become concerned that it wouldn't be able to deter both a Russian nuclear arsenal as well as a growing Chinese nuclear arsenal, then this could imperil the kinds of strategic arms control treaties that are so central to European security. And I'll stop there and thank you very much for your attention.
Super, thank you, Fiona. That was very interesting. Linda Desmale, welcome. You'll be commenting. You've joined the IES in April 2017 as a PhD researcher in the International Security Cluster, and we very much look forward to your comments. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Is this okay? Am I unmuted? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I definitely want to start by complimenting the paper. I think it's really clearly written. I especially compliment the nuance of your argument. I think it's very nice how you're very clear about the scope conditions of what you're trying to do and what you're not trying to do. So I really think that adds to the authority and the credibility of your argument. So I really liked it. I come myself more from a US grand strategy background. So I think that I will also in my comments seek perhaps to broaden the discussion a bit more to that. And I wanted to focus on two points. So first, your definition of the notion of feasibility, and then the issue of competing demands for US grand strategy to kind of also link the discussion more to Europe. So as you already mentioned in your presentation, your analysis of this feasibility of this naval blockade builds on a comparison you make with the Iraq maritime interception campaign to enforce UN sanctions on Iraq from 1990 to 2003. And from what I understand, you really look at feasibility through the lens of force requirements. So in the sense of US naval capacity and assistance of these Southeast Asian states that are bordering the choke points. And first, in that regard, I was wondering whether it suffices to only get the support of these Southeast Asian states at the choke points themselves, because you're talking about a distant blockade, which means that between those choke points and the actual destination in China, there can still be cargoes being sold, resold, and the ultimate ownership of ships might still change. And so even if the United States sets up this distant blockade, China can still buy neutral vessels, cargoes after they have passed this blockade, which would defeat its entire purpose. Although I realize that here I'm blurring the line between feasibility and effectiveness, of course. But more importantly, what I wanted to ask here, I was wondering a little bit about the comparability of the Iraq case and the China case. You alluded to the importance of support in the sense of legitimacy when discussing the Iraq case. And you mentioned that, for example, here in the case of a Southeast Asian blockade, there would obviously not be a UN Security Council mandate because, well, China would veto it, which might make it difficult for these Southeast Asian states to support the campaign, especially because they might be vulnerable to Chinese pressure. But when you think about feasibility and international support, I was wondering whether in the case of China, whether you should not broaden this discussion a bit more in the sense that for a lot of other countries in Asia, I think it's important to take into account the secondary effects of a Chinese economic downturn, which is ultimately the point of this blockade, because China's role in the global economy and supply chains is very different from the role that Iraq played. So I'm wondering to what extent these negative effects on the economies of these Asian states might also perhaps complicate US efforts to gather their support and thereby complicate the feasibility of the campaign. And also, I think on the other side of the equation in the Persian Gulf, China is a very important export market for many countries there. Cutting off supplies somehow to China might really disrupt the global oil markets, might really impact global commodity prices, cause severe economic disruptions for these exporters in the Middle Eastern region. So I was also wondering to what extent how these countries might position themselves in the blockade, how that would also perhaps impact the feasibility, and then, of course, as a consequence, the effectiveness of the blockades. And that basically brings me to my second point, which is, I think it's very interesting. You mentioned the issue of military trade-offs, and was also mentioned in the previous paper. So you discuss when you're talking about the availability of surface ships, that competing demands for the Navy's inventory would constrain the size and therefore the effectiveness of the blockade. And in light of my previous comment, I also wonder whether if we take this to a more let's say geopolitical, strategic level beyond the purely military sphere, whether this could also not create competing political demands. And I'm saying this to link the discussion to Europe. For example, you say yourself, in order to make up for the constrained access to Middle Eastern oil, China might start looking more to countries like Russia to secure supplies over land. And that might then push China and Russia together and so on and so forth, which I guess is also not a desirable outcome for the United States, and which is also not a desirable outcome for Europe. So even if then perhaps in one sense this policy might be less escalatory, I think because it requires so much international support, it might actually be politically more difficult. And if you then think of an air-sea battle or a fleet-to-fleet engagement, perhaps because it is more confined to the US-China relationship in the narrow sense of the word, it might be easier politically to do so. But I'm not saying that it would better. I'm not making a value judgment here. But I guess what I'm trying to say that I wonder when we move the question of feasibility, when we zoom out from the military requirements to the more political picture, whether that would sometimes perhaps change a little bit the equation you make, especially because you assess the feasibility of this naval blockade in a context in which a non-vital interest is at stake for the United States. So would it be willing to go through all these diplomatic things for something that is non-vital? But I realize I've been really playing the devil's advocate, because I thought your piece was very convincing, very great. And I think it could be interesting to broaden the discussion more and to push your argument further. So thanks.
All right. Thank you, Linda. Over to you, Fiona. Over to you.
So thank you very much, Linda, for those really insightful and I think important comments about the broader geopolitical context that's required for the success of this kind of a campaign. Part of the reason that I don't cover these in this particular paper is because there has been an extensive debate on blockade options, which has looked at some of these questions about the difficulties of the geopolitical coalitions that would need to be built in order to generate support for this kind of an issue. And Evan has written about this indeed as well. And so with this paper, I was trying to sort of fill the gaps that I think hadn't really been looked at, one of which is assuming feasibility and assuming China's reaction rather than really investigating those two. But I will just offer, I think, some brief comments on, I think, some of these geopolitical and economic kinds of questions. I think in some ways we're already seeing a greater degree of US-China economic competition and questions about reducing reliance on each other's economies that is spilling over to the calculations of allies in both Asia as well as Europe, perhaps only in tech domains as well, but we're already seeing, I think, what I would consider a greater degree of those kinds of considerations in peacetime before we even end up in this kind of contingency. The second point is I think that any conflict between the United States and China is going to end up having economic implications already that are going to cause problems for countries the world around in terms of what they're looking at. I'm not sure that that the delta or the difference between those two campaigns may be as significant once we start looking from that perspective. And the final point is as much as I agree with you that Russia forms the natural sort of alternative supplier, and there are some important implications for this kind of a campaign for China-Russia relations, I think it does put China in a position of relying much more on Russia than perhaps any great power would be comfortable on relying on another great power for their own security. So I will just note those couple of points, and thank you very much for those really, I think, insightful comments and for broadening the conversation to what it all might mean for Europe.
Thank you, Fiona. That brings us to the end of this second session, which looked at the role of different maritime strategies and how this may or may not escalate, which then brings us to the topic of the third session. And if you could bring the speakers on, please, where we have Erik Gartze and John Lindsay on the influence of sea power on politics. And then after that, there's Paul van Hooft with the paper. Evan already alluded to the title of the paper, All In or All Out, which is the other way around. It doesn't look at the influence of sea power on politics, but it looks at the influence of politics on sea power. We're going to start off with Erik Gartze and John Lindsay. I know Erik Gartze to be equally brilliant as contrarian, and his paper definitely did not disappoint us. Erik is a professor of political science and director of the Center for Peace and Security Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And John Lindsay is a professor at the University of Toronto with a background in computer science and military service. Erik, the floor is yours. If you could keep to your 7 minutes, that would be much appreciated.
Thank you. I hope I can be heard okay. It is early morning here, so please pardon my lack of coherence. You guys have all gotten the jump on us again, as always happens for people living in the Pacific. Thank you very much for inviting us, including us in this now sequence of events that I think has been rewarding for John and myself. We got started a number of years ago. I have 7 minutes to summarize 7 years of work. So I think where I would like to start is with an intuition that many people studying military affairs have had for a long time, that also leads to sort of a conundrum, which is that military affairs done properly are done by military people, that politicians in particular should stay out of that soup and let the military do their job. But as most of us are civilians, we're also meddling in military affairs a little bit. And politicians seem to be unable to resist the temptation to do this. And I think oftentimes in the study of military affairs, this is sort of written off as stupidity or hubris or something like that. But we wanted to take it seriously and ask the question, why do politicians keep getting drawn into the details of military affairs? And I think, we know the answer, we just don't want to accept it, which is these things matter for politics. War is the continuation of politics by other means. And so then is deterrence. And so then is showing the flag and posturing and so on. So force structure and force posture shape the possibilities of political outcomes in military affairs. And we want to treat this very seriously and start studying means and disaggregating means and looking at their implications. And we're doing that in a context where most of international relations talks about things like power or capabilities. And implicitly what they're doing is they're assuming that means are an undifferentiated good, that there's some equation, and you can go back and read examples where people actually try to do this. How much is an aircraft carrier worth in terms of infantry? Right? How many soldiers are equal to it? Well, the aircraft carrier is not going to show up on the same battlefield as that brigade. maybe some of the aircraft might, but the ship itself won't. So there is a non-fungibility to these in purely military terms, but even more so in political terms. The objectives that politicians have for military capabilities are shaped by the nature of those capabilities. What you buy is what you get. So as we're facing today important decisions about what the future of US and indeed the world's investment in military capabilities and force structure and also in force posture terms, this will shape what we're going to get. We applied this in the setting of naval power in a piece that was part of the special issue on security studies. And we found three basic things, looking at both a theoretical argument and then some statistics to kind of check to see if we were mostly right. Okay. So countries that invest heavily in navies are better able to project power further away. When they have contests, they tend to have them farther from home than countries that disproportionately invest in other forms of military power, like land power. They tend to have more influence. They're recognized more broadly by more countries for the same amount of effort in military defense. Those are both good things that navies will tell you that they can do. One of the bad things that maybe navies don't emphasize so much is that countries that invest disproportionately in naval power have more disputes. And we explain that in terms of the very strengths of naval power. They can be where you want them to be, but that means where they are depends upon where you want them to be at that moment, and not necessarily what you promised you would do at some distant time in the past. And that's the nature of mobility. Mobility is instability. It means that you can play a role in more processes in more places, but it also means that people can imagine you won't reasonably. You can't be everywhere at once, and therefore you may not be at a particular point in time where you would prove pivotal. Okay, so we extend this in the War on the Rocks piece to the question of future decisions about US naval power. And we make the contrarian argument that, in fact, if the US wants to promote deterrence and stability, that it makes some sense for the US to invest disproportionately on more stable forms of military capability, in particular land-based forces. Where the US deploys significant portions of its land-based capabilities will have a disproportionate effect in stabilizing and deterring potential challengers. And we mostly talked in that piece on the Pacific, but we can extend this to Europe. The US has a classic problem of a declining power. Is it going to play zone defense, or is it going to play man-to-man? If it chooses to invest disproportionately heavily in naval power, it will have both the opportunity and the curse to be wherever it wants to be on the world's globe, but it will increase uncertainty and instability about what, in fact, the US will do, and that will encourage challengers to act more aggressively in more places. We saw this in the recent rhetoric about the pivot to Asia. This kind of emboldened Putin and Russia a little bit. So we're advocating emphasizing more stabilizing forces and less on dynamic, somewhat destabilizing forces. And the Navy still needs to play a role in resupply and so on. And this would have an important implication for Europe. If the US followed our recommendation, which is almost certainly not going to be the case for our purposes, then nobody's going to hear us in Washington. But if for some reason somebody listened, then the US would have a dilemma of a different kind, which would be it could either spend a lot more on defense to cover all the places that it says it cares about with robust land capabilities or air capability, or it would have to choose to triage. It would have to pick priorities. And according to the rhetoric right now, according to doctrine, Asia is our first priority. So that might mean that, for example, Europe would have to step up and play a more auspicious, more expensive role in its own security. This is, of course, the nature of the debate that's going on right now in the United States. And I don't pretend to we don't pretend to have answers about what the right answer is, only about the implications of which kind of answer you choose. But it is true that the strategic geopolitical situation in Europe and indeed the world is different today than it was 10 years ago or indeed 50 years ago. Europe could afford to increase its own defense capabilities. And in a strange way, this is a double advantage for the United States because you seldom get your cake and eat it too. But Europe still has the same principal agency or collective action problem that it had 25 years ago with the WEU, which is ultimately nobody in Europe wants anybody else in Europe to be in charge. And so in all likelihood, the US would continue to play an important role in NATO and in European security, even if it chose to have a declining role in contributing to that defense. Thank you.
And thank you, Erik. Back over to you, Louis. Welcome back. We're eager to hear your thoughts. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this article, which I also very much enjoyed. So my sense is that Erik and John, if I may, go against the conventional wisdom that naval powers bring stability into the system. According to Spikeman, sea powers are much less invasive and intrusive in other countries' politics than land powers are, right? In the sense that land powers typically want direct control, whereas sea powers want influence, which is often exercised indirectly. Among other things, that means that sea powers are critical to the underpinning of regional balances of power, which actually brings stability to the international system. So according to this paper, naval force leads powers to behave more aggressively and also to be more whimsical, unpredictable, and disorderly in resorting to military force, right? In the sense that they can decide one day to intervene in some place or not, and then the next day can just cut loose and leave that place in flames. I'm adding some drama, of course, but this really strikes me as an important contribution to the literature, and one that, by the way, is grounded in serious statistical analysis. However, I'm left wondering to what extent you're actually going against the conventional wisdom that sea powers bring stability into the system, so much as nuancing that point. Because ultimately, Spikeman's argument, and I keep coming back to Spikeman because we are in the Netherlands, but my sense here is that other classics would agree with him. But so the argument by Spikeman is that sea power brings stability with a capital S in the sense that it helps underpin balances of power, precisely because sea powers do not want to control small and medium states, not least because it is not cost efficient to do so. They need them to stand on their own feet, and that's important for the formation of balances of power. Now, what you're saying in the paper, unless I totally misread it, is that sea power undermines stability, but with a small s, as in it is likely to result in more conflict, regardless of how that may affect power balances. So you're talking about something else. What does this, so that's sort of my main comment. And then I wonder, what does this all mean for debates on US grand strategy? And in a way, I think this paper links quite nicely with Evan's paper, in the sense that you sort of imply that a naval power has ways to preserve influence in a region, i.e., going back to Evan's theme, through punishment measures that can keep regional powers in check, even if they are destabilizing and leave a mess behind. So once again, I wonder to what extent you may not be vindicating restraint or offshore balancing, in the sense that sea powers may not necessarily care about stability for the sake of it, but rather about influence, or more precisely about preventing a regional power from dominating, from rising and dominating a given region. So a naval power with global ambitions and a divided attention like the United States can presumably use its naval capabilities to do just that, by eroding the capabilities of a rising regional power time and again, sort of mowing the lawn, So why should a great power like the United States care about stability? And that connects with my last point, which is I was wondering whether factors such as the region under consideration or the stakes at play are not rather relevant intervening variables here for your puzzle, and whether the paper would not be better served by shifting a bit the focus from the impact of naval power or specific naval assets on conflict to looking at the conditions under which naval power can lead to certain outcomes. For instance, trading influence for instability may have different implications for a great power depending on the region at hand, right? If we go back to the United States, in the Middle East, a naval approach may indeed allow you to exercise influence without engaging too much, which is important because it allows you to preserve your flexibility, that flexibility that you need to project power into other regions, which is an argument that you make very clearly. But the kind of instability that derives from you engaging in that region, i.e. because of deterrence failures or having a lower threshold for conflict initiation or conflict exit, as you put it, may have systemic negative economic effects and have a negative impact on the flow of hydrocarbons, for instance, when it comes to the Middle East. So in regions of greater economic importance, like East Asia or Europe, the influence instability trade-off may look different for the United States in the sense that chronic instability in those regions can lead to economic disruption and damage US economic interests over the long term. So that may advise against the Navy only or Navy predominantly naval approach and constitute an incentive for forward presence. Incidentally, and I was wondering about this. This could also link to the long-standing debate in the IR literature about absolute and relative gains, in the sense that in a context of intensifying great power competition, in which the gap between a rising power and established power is fast closing, the latter may be more willing to accept incurring in absolute losses and thus tolerate higher instability for the sake of relative gains vis-a-vis its competing power. I think I'll just leave it at that, but I really, just to say that I really enjoyed the paper. It was very stimulating.
And thank you, Louis. John joined us as well. Welcome, John. John, I don't know whether you got everything from the beginning. You did. So, gentlemen, if you would like to respond, please take a few minutes, but then let's move over to the second paper. Erik or John, who's first?
Absolutely. Thanks very much for the opportunity to join, and thanks, Louis, for the generous comment. I think I want to enthusiastically endorse your site of Speakman. Of course, Julian Corbett made similar points that navies are less threatening to others, and this is kind of exactly our point, right? So Corbett and Speakman are talking, hey, navies may be less threatening because they don't have this possibility of continuing to march on your capital. That may speak to the compellence piece, but when we think about deterrence, the problem is exactly that navies are potentially less threatening, or at least you're not sure what their resolve and their interests are going to be. So I think that brings up your second point, which we also would kind of concur with, that this question about resolve and whether instability matters more for states that are less valuable to the naval power. That may very well be the case, and the problem is that it's hard to tell how much the naval power cares about these things, because it's not clear whether the naval power is going to stay or whether it's going to leave, because the possibility of leaving is built into naval force structure. So I think that this question of like, hey, are navies less threatening? Potentially, that's the problem. Do navies deal with areas where you have less resolve? Potentially, and that's the problem. So we can kind of think about this with respect to two different kinds of challenges that the naval power may get involved in. One would be the problem of weaker actors in faraway peripheral areas. We know the Navy can go there. There's no question about what the balance of power would be if it intervenes. But there may be real questions about how much the naval power cares, whether they will stay to complete the conflict, okay? And so that weaker power may be willing to risk this contest to demonstrate greater resolve. Another kind of actor would be the stronger power, right? That is going to gamble that the naval power is not willing to risk showing up in the first place. So in the first case, the question is, the naval power might eventually leave. In the second case, the question is they may not actually show up. So it's this uncertainty about the actual local balance of power and resolve that in a sense is built into force structures that emphasize mobility and stealth.
If I could add really quickly, there's a direct tension between stability and influence, okay? And I think that these things get conflated all the time when we talk about them, and it's very useful to separate them out. They're both important, and that's why they get conflated, because why wouldn't somebody in this process who has an interest want to be claiming that they can do both? But you can't. If you want to leverage what you can do to others as much as possible, you want to claim that you can do a lot to many, but that means that there's more question marks on the part of others about what you'll actually be able to. Commitment is central to deterrence, pre-commitment, right? If you know for a fact what's going to happen if you make an action and you don't want that thing to happen, then that's deterrence. But navies aren't particularly good at pre-commitment because of their mobility. I liken navies to the cavalry of old. One of the first signs that you were losing a battle was when your cavalry decided that they wanted to go home, right? And again in battles, if you look at a pivotal moment in the battle, it's when one side's cavalry decided to leave the field. The infantry doesn't decide to leave the field right away because they can't. And so mobility, which is critical in maneuver warfare, is also critical in degrading the quality of the deterrent threat that you make. And that's the problem that navies pose. Precisely because they can be in so many places, they influence more than other forms of power because you can point them in many directions. This is why governments, leaders like mobile platforms, they want to be able to have discretion to act as they see fit at the last minute. And certainly navies could prove pivotal in influence and in winning contests. But for that very reason, they increase the risk that the contest will have to occur for somebody to figure out who's going to win that contest. So our pitch is that if you're interested in stability, you want to make yourself as predictable as possible. And investing heavily in platforms that are good at making the world less predictable does the opposite.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for those observations, Louis. Let's move on to Paul van Hooft with his paper, All In or All Out, Why Insularity Pushes and Pulls American Grand Strategy to Extremes. Paul van Hooft is a colleague of mine here at HCSS, a senior strategic analyst, and he's the co-chair of our initiative on the future of transatlantic relations. In the past 2 years, he spent as a postdoctoral fellow at the Security Studies program of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Paul, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Since I'm up last, I think I have a responsibility to keep my comments as short as possible. All right. So my argument very nicely builds on what Erik and John just argued, namely that there's something very particular about naval powers, about maritime powers, that changes the options they have grand strategically. Hence the title, All In or All Out, Why Insularity Pushes and Pulls American Grand Strategy. All right. Now, it's often easy to forget that how insulated the US is compared to historically to any other great power, how insulated it is from threats, partly by design and partly by historical accident. It has weak neighbors to the north and south. It created regional dominance over a century ago, ensured that through the Monroe Doctrine, that outside powers were kept out, and basically was free to roam and stay out of others' business or involve itself in them. So this is not a new observation. Insularity provides the US with abundant security. The idea of stopping power of water, that once you have an organized state that can invest in a navy, you can turn the water into a real obstacle for offensive actions against that state. Yet at the same time, if you ensure that you have naval dominance, that same water that is a block, that is a wall to the others, becomes a highway that allows you to project power across the world, right? That gives naval power specific properties, their grand strategies specific properties. They can go anywhere, they can intervene on behalf of whomever, at least if these other states are somewhat connected to the water itself, right? They can readjust the regional balance of power, they can upset it, they can do anything that they want, right? Now, before the US, the UK, the Netherlands, Portugal played similar roles. They could use their navy, they could blockade, as we've already talked about this afternoon, they could allow land forces to land, they could do a variety of things to ensure that they had an international environment that was more conducive to their wishes. Yet at the same time, they could also restrain themselves, which made with the argument traditionally being that therefore maritime powers, sea powers are less threatening to others, right? And historically what that has meant for the US is that it is used as command of the commons, this ability to go anywhere and project military powers to prevent the domination of the key geopolitical regions of the world, Asia, Europe, and depending on who considers it as central, but the Middle East, at least the oil supplies in the Middle East. It prevents regional rivalries in these regions, and it dampens the spread of weapons of mass destruction. It ensures that these other states don't necessarily need these weapons to protect themselves. That is the traditional argument for US hegemony and how it's connected to naval power. Yet I argue, and it picks up from Erik's and John's argument just now, I argue that precisely because the US is inherently secure, right, because it's inherently safer from attack, it is also clear that it has less at stake anywhere else. Right? So if the regional balance of power in Europe was upset, if a great power looked like it was about to rise, that would directly or much more directly impact everybody else's security in Europe. That is not the same for the US. Right? It's an extra regional power in every other region by definition. And another way of putting it is precisely because the US is less threatening inherently, it is less threatened and therefore it is less threatening. Right? It has less stake, so therefore the balance of interest, the balance of resolve is not in its advantage. It has asymmetric stakes in every region, and that makes reassurance of allies and deterrence more difficult for the US. It's a credibility problem. Still, it needs allies, it needs footholds, right? The command of the water, the command of the maritime commons still depends on logistics, it depends on supplies, it depends on forward disposed fuel depots, right? So internationally, to compensate for these asymmetric stakes, the US has historically done a few things, right? It has ensured that it demonstrates to its allies and adversaries that it has something at stake by literally locating itself in the region, by becoming from a sea power a land power, right? It is also ensured and has had to ensure that it had military superiority, because if you think about it domestically, given that the stakes, there's no threatening neighbor next door, the threats are abstract and on the other side of the world, there needs to be low costs, and domestically there needs to be a very strong narrative that the threats that exist, that require these resources, that require this shedding of blood and treasure, that these are existential threat. Right? So in the paper, I argue that you can see this dynamic in the Cold War, right, where the original strategy was a strong point defense, very limited involvement, and that involvement escalated and escalated, precisely as it became easier during the 50s and 60s for the US to disengage because the costs of that commitment started increasing, right? Those costs of that commitment started increasing because of the Soviet capabilities in intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, that has clear and obvious impact for the current competition between the US and China in their struggle over the command of the Western Pacific and perhaps even the Indo-Pacific writ large. What China has done is not compete like for like. It is not trying to be the equal of the US globally. It has simply pursued regionally strategies that raise the cost for the US. Because the one thing that all things being equal, that the US can do is incur greater costs than its adversaries, right? And the whole suite of anti-access aerial denial capabilities, the long-range missiles, the cruise missiles, the ballistic missiles, the ones that can target US surface ships, but they can also target the ports, they can target the central logistics hub of the island of Guam. What these do is that these make it more, not only physically more difficult for the US to project power, but they make it politically more costly. And US allies know this. The US knows this, US allies know this. So it also creates an escalatory dynamic that is not entirely the same yet as the one we saw during the Cold War in the European theater, but which has some elements of this. So the US counters to Chinese anti-access aerial denial capabilities are to invest in other doctrine, air sea battle, or which is now being renamed to an even less accessible term, the joint concept for access and maneuver in the global commons. But these doctrines focus on hitting China in on the mainland in very politically sensitive areas, which would then likely precipitate or be difficult to distinguish as Fiona Cunningham and Taylor Fravel, as Caitlin Talmadge and others have argued, would be very difficult to distinguish from a first nuclear strike, right? And what we've also seen in the last few years is that on the part of the Trump administration, and that there's been painting China as an existential threat, not just as an abstract threat in the balance of power, right? But as a real existential evil that must be combated. And we've seen an escalation in that kind of rhetoric. So to conclude, what I'm arguing why the US is either all in or all out is that there's a circularity to US strategy. The US needs access, therefore it needs allies. To have these allies, it needs to be able to feasibly win at low costs. To win at low costs, it needs military superiority. Any asymmetric strategy must therefore be met with even greater investment in these technologies, right? Shows of, if the balance of interest is not yet already clear, then actions elsewhere, the outcomes of peripheral conflicts become more important in demonstrating US resolve and US credibility. As historically as a pattern, specifically in the US, because the US is the most secure great power in history. So therefore, the US cannot find this happy medium, this nicely balanced strategy. It tends to overshoot or undershoot, with inadvertent nuclear escalation being a particularly great risk here. So without going into that, although I do in the paper, the whole debate in US academia and in DC on whether the US should pursue strategies of retrenchment, whether it should perhaps hold back somewhat, are more difficult for the US to manage. Right? It becomes easier to kind of do too little, or if trying to hold on to the status quo, to do too much. Right? So it also means that the US is likelier in the current situation, if I'm correct, that this dynamic is even likelier to push the US to focus on Asia over Europe. Right? That would mean that Europeans, in a variety of manners, need to also think about investing more in naval capabilities to guard their regional commons. Then what can be done in Asia is much more difficult. We can think of competing A2AD bubbles to make it even more difficult for China to pursue aggressive military actions of its own, but perhaps the thought should really be on what kind of other non-military measures could contain the rise of China's influence. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
And thank you, Paul, for tying it together at the end of this symposium. Before we're going to sort of invite all speakers back to the stage, let's invite Linde Desmale back again and ask Linde to comment. Hi, Linde, you're back. If you could unmute, go right ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, okay. So thank you, Paul, for inviting me to comment on your very interesting paper. I really like the fact that you're adding a new lens to like an old debate, and that you're trying to kind of shift some of the parameters of that debate. I think that's a very interesting and a very relevant exercise. And so from how I understood your argument is that you're saying debates on US grand strategy, it's often should the US be forward presence, forward leaning, or should it be more reactive? And different authors have very different views on how proactive or how reactive the US should be. But then you're arguing, from what I understood, that this is somewhat unproductive because of this insular position, the US is automatically pushed to extremes. It's either dangerous escalation or full retreats. And then in addition, you're also saying, but you discussed this a little bit less in the presentation, that retrenchment strategies, so offshore balancing, restraint, and so on, are unlikely to succeed because they would de facto pull the US in full retreat, which would then damage its command of the commons and would make it difficult to re-enter in the Western Pacific in case of a conflict with China that would then threaten to upset the regional balance of power. And I think the main arguments that you raise for why this re-entry would be very difficult or de facto impossible is that you need allied and domestic support as the United States. And so I would like to put on my retrencher shoes, so to speak. I mean, I'm neither of those because I'm not American, so it doesn't really matter. But if I were to think like a retrencher, I was thinking, how could I seek to counter these arguments just to challenge you a little bit? So you argue that if the United States would retrench, that would expose allies to the risks of would-be regional hegemons, which may make it more attractive to them to start shirking or hiding. But I was wondering, why do you think that is the case? Because most retrenchers, and I'm especially thinking here of Barry Posen, make the argument that balancing behavior is more common than bandwagoning behavior. And I have the impression that you are claiming the opposite. And I was wondering why that is the case, because also in your piece, you mentioned that before the Cold War, when the US had no permanent bases in Europe, so before the Cold War, the US had no permanent bases in Europe. However, in World War I, we do have the US that has access to ports in Britain and France. In World War II, Britain. So there it basically might create the impression that when push comes to shove, those Europeans are happy to allow the US to come back in order to help them prevent regional hegemony. So I'm wondering, why do you think that today in the Western Pacific, which is the case that you're looking at, why a similar development would not be likely? And then secondly, you also mentioned the issue of domestic support, that the United States needs to be able to somehow sell the threat domestically to convince its public to spend at the level needed for US military technological superiority. And I'm wondering whether here I think this is difficult because we don't really have a counterfactual here. And I'm wondering whether there are any historical cases you can think of where this really happened and where you see, well, the narrative disappeared, so the defense spending went down. Because I know that we often say this, that, okay, the US public would not be supportive of a war with China and so on and so forth. However, then at the same time, people would often point at public opinion polls and say, but Americans are very supportive of the alliance structure. And even after the Cold War, you see this existential threat of the Soviet Union disappears. There is indeed a decrease in the US defense budget, but it really does not go to pre-Cold War era numbers. And I'm not quite sure whether you need an existential threat to be able to be the indispensable nation. I'm thinking of the Obama administration, which was very careful not to talk too much about competition, which was very much about the liberal international order, cooperating on non-traditional threats, on climate change, non-proliferation, and so on and so forth. So still holding on to this idea of the indispensable nation to justify high defense spending, but do you need an existential threat to be able to be an indispensable nation? I'm wondering what you think about that. And then thirdly, perhaps you also argue that if the US were to retrench, that would give adversaries a lot of time and a lot of space to reinforce cost raising countermeasures to US power projection. But then I think restrainers or retrenchers would perhaps say, well, following the logic of a security dilemma, it's precisely US presence that actually encourages them to develop these measures. I'm thinking about the famous Mearsheimer argument, the Ukraine crisis and Russian aggression. It is the West's fault. If the US wouldn't have been there, they wouldn't have done it. So, and also in the paper, you say that Chinese investments in these A2AD capabilities are a direct response to Chinese military superiority. So I'm just wondering, how would you counter perhaps the retrenchment counter argument there? But as I'm saying, I'm really being the devil's advocate because I actually agree with many of the things that you say. And then finally, perhaps to link the discussion to Europe, you apply very much your lens to the Western Pacific, and I was wondering whether you would argue in Europe, is the US pushing for escalation in Europe today? Would you make that argument? And yes, if yes, why? And if no, how transferable is your framework on the Asia Pacific or the Western Pacific? How much can you transfer it to other regions as well, where in the end similar dilemmas and similar tensions play out? But overall, I mean, I found this a very interesting exercise. So I really enjoyed reading the paper. So really congratulations on it.
Thank you, Linda. And Paul, before we go over to you and have you at least reflect on some of the points raised by Linda, and relevant points raised by Linda. For the sake of time, I wanted to say, let's go 10 to 15 minutes over schedule. So let's wrap up at the latest by 5:45. What I would like to do is have Paul respond to some of these comments, then ask all the presenters back on stage. And then I'm going to put one central question to you, presenters, pertaining to a future research agenda, because I think that is central, and then we're going to wrap up. But first, Paul, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Linda. These were excellent questions. Well, I'll just try to do them really shortly. I'll do them in reverse. That's also a better way to do them. So the US is, as I say in a few sentences near the end, in some ways the US would be better off if it lent into Europe, because that's the easier challenge. Because what I argue is it's really this, when the US can be challenged, is that these dynamics happen. So Russia cannot really challenge the US in Europe. It's really the problem the problem of Russia is because the US is trying to do everything in every region at the same time, right? So the dynamic applied in Cold War Europe, and it applies now in Asia, right? Because of that logic of raising costs, which is also what I would argue, which would make it hard, which is where I disagree with the retrenchers, is that once you're out, it becomes more difficult to get in, right? Because then you need the footholds, and if those footholds are not already there, especially with current missile technologies, those footholds, whatever you could have or whatever would be available, could be easily threatened. And then I don't argue necessarily that all allies at all times will shirk, but in the maritime environment of the Asia Pacific, where you can invest in means to keep a potential Chinese adversary at bay, it is more attractive to shirk and not to try to to place yourself in the middle of a firing competition between two superpowers, right? Because you can probably do enough, amphibious landings for anyone are going to be basically impossible in the current era, at least any major power. So that's what I argue. And when it comes to the domestic audience, well, the US gained hegemony compared to any other great power in history at incredibly low costs. Right? And that's not to diminish American casualties during the two world wars, or during Vietnam and the Korean War, or Afghanistan and Iraq. But look at what European states had to do to hold on to power for so long. So in that sense, and we can see that once the casualties go up in Vietnam, in the wars, so-called war on terror, that is much more difficult. So that's where, yes, it is sort of speculative, you could argue, but I think that there's much more ambiguity about what's really at stake here than there was in Cold War Europe, and I'll leave it there.
Great, Paul, and thank you very much, Linda. Can I ask for all speakers to be invited back to the stage? We're nearing the end of our seminar, our symposium, to launch the special issue of security studies. I think that John Caverley and Pete Dombrowski did a tremendous job in putting together a special issue on such an important issue. with very interesting and relevant contributions, right? I mean, I'm not going to tie it all together, but by means of a wrap up, there's 2 papers that look at the characteristics of the maritime domain and look at the relevance of the maritime domain and its relationship, the relevance and relationship with international security. Then it goes on deeper and it looks on the dynamics of maritime strategic competition, looks at specific and different maritime strategies and the implications for global great power relations. And then it goes even further and it seeks to disentangle the impact of specific maritime capabilities on international relations, including diplomatic recognition and dispute initiation on the one hand. And there is an attempt by Paul van Hooft to look at the impacts of politics through geography on power projection. So I think it's a very sort of urgent and timely, but also a very well-rounded and interesting special issue, which to me, while reading the papers and listening to the presentations, spur a number of interesting questions that are both relevant for scholarly reasons and for professional reasons, right? I mean, what about escalation dynamics of naval blockades? I think, Fiona, you alluded to the fact that we know quite a bit of them. I would like to find out more about it. Or what about the impact of maritime power projection on influence projection on the one hand and stability on the other? One of the interesting points raised by one of our commentators. But also, if you look at sort of policy, how is European maritime security different from Asian maritime security? For us in Europe, that is of course not trivial. But if you want to look at it in a global perspective, what happens if you have simultaneous escalation in both the Asian theater and the European theater? What is the division of labor between the US and Europe, if there is such a division? So this symposium spurs a lot of interesting questions, both scholarly and political ones, if you like. But I wanted to sort of wrap up. We have about 10 minutes left and ask our authors, if you think about a research agenda, and Jonathan and Peter, I'm going to start off with you as the editors of this issue, but then I'm also going to ask the other authors, if you think about the future research agenda for maritime competition and maritime great power competition, what further aspects, both substantive ones as well as methodological ones, do you think we need to take up? I mean, there's a great many listeners who may be willing and able to pick up that law. So, Peter.
Tim, I do want to do one thing before I answer your question, which is to note that the security studies issue is available online. A couple of the articles are ungated, so you can read them without having to download or pay for them. It's volume 29, issue 4, 2020. The title is Security Studies in a New Era of Maritime Competition.
Peter, I was going to wrap up with that. No worries. But
I'm sorry. I just want
happy that you did it. Go ahead.
Okay. And I wanted to thank you for hosting and doing an excellent job of keeping us all on track. I didn't give our disclaimer. John and I work for the U.S. government, so we're speaking privately. I think I will leave the agenda to the other authors since I did some housekeeping in my time, but really thank you all for contributing. I learned a lot just from listening to you talk in addition to reading all the papers. Thank you very much.
Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to add and lay out the research agenda there?
I think just to join Peter in thanking everyone, and I do want to hear what the author said. I think one thing that's fascinating about maritime competition is, as we in the United States are trying to figure out how the Navy is supposed to look like in 2045, according to Secretary Esper, is how slow moving these factors are. These are glacial changes that are often outpaced by geopolitical changes, which are themselves quite slow. And so for a variety of reasons, it takes forever to build a ship, right? It takes forever to figure out how to pay for the ship. And then you have to figure out how to operate the ship. And so that's one thing that people don't quite grasp about naval and maritime forces, is how slow they change, which might make it easier to study, but it also means you're probably going to have a hangover going forward. And I think more people need to write about that. But thank you very much for this wonderful symposium.
Super, and thank you for those thoughts, Jonathan. Sarah, can we give the floor to you and hear your thoughts about the future research agenda, perhaps involving the issue of correlates of war data set?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think more attention to how when diplomatic issues come together. So if countries have multiple points of disagreement, that obviously is problematic. So understanding those connections. I attended two conferences, I guess, within the span of 2 years. One was the Bridging the Straits conference at the Naval War College. And then I also attended a maritime conference in Canada, which was mostly international law scholars. And I felt like I was in two different universes. So maybe one piece of advice I would have is for security studies folks to have more engagement with international law, maritime law scholars, because I think there's a lot of useful dialogue that could happen.
Great, and thank you for that call for multidisciplinarity, as they call it. And I think that the current issue is already an attempt to straddle or bridge different disciplines to get a better understanding of a topic of great importance. But your point is well taken. Evan, over to you. Your thoughts on a future research agenda. Go ahead.
Great, thanks, and thanks to you, Tim, and for hosting, and thanks to all my colleagues here. I'll just make 2 quick points. One, building on John's observation about timelines. You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about how our time horizons have been affected or not affected when it comes to balancing against China, especially in the maritime domain. And it strikes me that, you know, we've had previously we approached China as a 20 or 30-year problem down the road. Now it's increasingly looking like a 3 or 5 or 10-year problem, and yet we still have solutions that are going to take decades to materialize. So there's something there that I think we need to reconcile in terms of our perspective. And then the other, I'll just mention again, something I noted in my remarks, the alliance piece of this, the ally piece of this. Traditionally, we've pushed our allies to either kind of double down in their home region in terms of territorial defense, or to support the United States in expeditionary operations overseas. And now we're kind of asking them to do both potentially. And there's some inherent tensions there that I think we need to tease out. Thank you.
Great. Yes, I was reminded of that famous remark, hide your strength, bide your time. And perhaps it's fair to conclude that adage is no longer valid. But I was also thinking back both of sort of the time it really takes to get to know how to operate an aircraft carrier, and where that started out with that second-hand Ukrainian aircraft carrier. And now I think we're about 10 years down the road, is slowly on sort of emerging or merging, morphing into an actual capability. I'm talking, of course, about PLAN, the PLA Navy. Fiona, you know a lot more about that than I do. So please, your thoughts on a future research agenda.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute a few thoughts. So I would just point to 3 things. I think the first is that we definitely need more research on, from my perspective, how China thinks about different escalation thresholds in conflict. We have some pretty good, I think, indication that they think the nuclear threshold is a particularly salient one, but a lot of the other thresholds that we think about in great power conflict are imported from the Cold War, things like the homeland sanctuary, targeting civilians, etc. And we just don't have a really good idea as to whether or not those same things matter to China. And I think that's critical when we think about the impacts of in particular, military operations and the success of deterrence. The second point that I would suggest we need to think a little bit more about is when we are talking about maritime competition, we're often talking about kind of holding the line above the threshold of armed conflict. And of course, that's very important, but it does also end up pushing competition into the subconventional domain. And so I think thinking a bit more about the relationship between how the conventional balance relates to some of these subconventional domains, I think would be a worthwhile endeavor. And finally, thinking about the connections between the maritime domain and its sort of geographical manifestations and competition in some of the, I guess, less geographically bounded domains of information, cyberspace, and outer space, which I think are really important to a lot of the naval competition kinds of questions, but don't obey the same kinds of bounds as we'd otherwise see. So I'd say they're the three areas, and I point to John and Erik have done some great work on this latter question already.
Great. Thank you, Fiona. Erik.
Well, I should yield my time to John because I've been doing most of the speaking for our team, but I never seem to end up doing that. Two quick suggestions for research agendas. One, we got to stop this 2,000-year history of failing to break up the distinction between who gets what and how you go about getting it. Both issues are relevant in the study of military affairs and in politics, but they're different, okay? The balance of power tells us next to nothing about whether you're going to have a contest. It'll tell you a lot about what's going to happen if you have a contest. But because it tells you a lot about what's going to happen if you have a contest, when it's obvious, the contest doesn't occur. Right? Mexico has stopped invading the United States, strangely enough, even though it still feels like part of the US belongs to Mexico. Okay, so I think that moving forward, we got to differentiate between means and ends because these two things work differently. If you're talking about the balance of power, you're probably telling people a lot about where contests will occur, not whether. And then related to that is take geography seriously. We all have globes and maps on our institutional logos, but we never introduce that into our theories. Show me in a realist theory or a balance of power theory where it seriously treats the globe. Geography matters because it attrits your capabilities. You may be a dominant power somewhere. The most recent commander of Indo-PACOM made this point. He said, you know, China's no longer a near peer competitor where China cares to compete. So we got to think not about where power, whether power matters or how power matters, but where power matters in thinking about.
Thank you, Erik. So in addition to a shift in sort of an attention towards time and timing in IR, also a call for renewed appreciation for the role of geography. John, anything to add there, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to double down on Fiona's recommendation for more insight into Chinese perspectives on all these issues, right? I mean, China seems to be adopting this very Mahanian view of the world, as did Imperial Japan, as did the United States as it was rising, and so that kind of begs the question of like, why are states so attracted to this, and what are the implications there? When a lot of the research here, Fiona's, Evans, maybe Erik and I and others have kind of pointed to these more Corbettian, peripheral solutions. So if there's this real kind of doctrinal mismatch to the nature of naval power, how do we understand that in this context? And then secondly, and maybe kind of continue on that, I'd also like to echo Erik's call for more attention to geography and the fact that a lot of these naval conflicts are taking place on the seams of domains, right? I mean, like most naval battles are in littoral areas. The only exception is like the Battle of Atlantic, and that's defined by shore-based defenses, right, that create the space for that to happen. So I think we need to look at that, and particularly look at the fact that that littoral geography is going to be changing significantly in the coming decades. Climate change is going to make some small countries go away, is going to flood low-lying coastal areas. Speaking from the Canadian perspective, right, it's opening up the Arctic. Okay, so these peripheral issues, I think, are going to be potential sites for naval conflict outside of kind of the big confrontations that we're thinking about. So how do we understand that, and how do we understand the linkage between peripheral and more main force issues?
Good, John. And that brings us to Paul van Hooft, to pronounce his last name in the Dutch way. Paul, over to you. Let me mute myself.
Thank you. That's it'll be one of the first conferences where it's pronounced correctly. I'd like to build on those comments, and specifically that we need to think more about not treat history in this kind of undefined manner, as if all these crises and all these big grand strategic shifts were preordained by some kind of fate. These were very specific, by geographic, military problems that specific actors handled in specific manners. Right? And specifically here, a lot of what we understand about the current world order is based on solving a particular problem of a destroyed Europe after the end of World War II and the Cold War, and how the US should be credible there or not. And to just transplant this sort of willy-nilly as a universal model for stability seems to me to be a wrong-headed direction, specifically if we take into account that the US is rather unique in many ways, historically and geographically. So I think that's part of it. And then to build on that, which is what we're trying to do here at the center, I think we're at the end of the day, so we deserve a little plug for ourselves, I guess. But what we're trying to do here at the center with our new initiative on the future of transatlantic relations is really to think about, given that we have these continued shared interests, shared values, but that these constraints are no longer the same, that the logic of geography will no longer work in the same way, or with these the changing political problems. It's how do we plug in allies, to be a little bit more self-sustained and self-sufficient, but also to kind of uphold the bits of international order that we kind of like. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I wanted to say, I think, ladies and gentlemen, we got our homework spelled out for us. So I wanted to thank all the presenters. I wanted to thank all the commentators for their very interesting insights. And I wanted to echo Peter, I'm just going to underline it one more time, to go to the homepage of Security Studies, download the latest issue. If you don't have access to all these very costly scholarly subscriptions, then please know that at least some of the chapters, I think by Peter and Jonathan, and also the one by Paul, are open access. With that, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope to see you again in the future. Thanks, and have a great day in the West Coast, and a great afternoon and evening here in Europe. Bye-bye.